spending money like water was the answer to our country's problems, we would have no problems now.
Once again, Wednesday night means that it is time for Modern Comments Radio here on Vigilant Liberty Radio. And that would mean that it is time for our erstwhile host, Amy, to, well, do her thing. Go right ahead, Amy.
Good evening, and that is Taylor, my producer. How are you this evening, Taylor?
As long as I keep all four chair legs on the floor, I ought to be okay.
Thanks. And thanks for tuning in to Vigilant Liberty Radio and the Modern Comments Radio Show. I am pleased to welcome to the program this evening a first-time guest and fellow Milwaukeean, Ben Lund, who you can find on Twitter at Eastside Rambler. Good evening, Ben. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing very well. Glad to join you.
Thanks, and thanks for agreeing to be on the program. I'm very excited and looking forward to it.
Doing great, Amy. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for being on the program. Also joining us this evening is the sometimes guest and my husband, Dave.
Hello.
Who has agreed to sit in as well, because we are going to be talking about Wisconsin politics. It's time for another Cheesehead special. And we're going to start off with something that I've wanted to do on the show for a while, and that's talk about sports. And we're going to talk about sports because the news came over on Friday that the Packers have decided to induct Brett Favre into the Green Bay Packers Hall of Fame, and that the Packers will retire Favre's jersey, the iconic number 4. And they will do this July 18th of 2015. And if you know anything about sports, anything about football, you will know how big of an icon Brett Favre was to us here in Wisconsin through his long career, his storied career. And I don't want to use the word nightmare, but how controversial it was when he decided to retire and then unretire and ended up going and playing for 2 other teams, including the despised Minnesota Vikings.
We call that going over to the dark side in Wisconsin.
Yes. And there's a lot of, I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this one, but there were issues going on between Favre and Packers GM Ted Thompson, excuse me. And all of that sort of backstory and the back drama, but that dominated the news cycle for a long time. And I was surprised when I saw this news on Friday that they were going to retire his jersey and induct him to the Hall of Fame so soon. I expected it to be a couple of years just because he had, I don't know how else to say it, broken our hearts by leaving and then coming back to two other teams after leaving the Packers. So I want to open this up because I'm sure you guys have a lot to say about it. I'll start with you, Dave, because I can tell you're chomping at the bit to say something.
Well, it's nothing unusual for a star player to end his career with another team. So if Favre had ended his career with a season or 2 with the Jets, nobody would have minded. I mean, Bill Montana ended his career with the Chiefs. Reggie White ended his with the Panthers. That's not uncommon for somebody to wrap up elsewhere, but it was a big thing when Favre somehow managed to get over to the Vikings. And the first year he did very well. They made it to the playoffs where they inevitably choked, and I have to say that brought delight to the heart of Packer fans when they just went for the playoffs. And then Favre fell apart. He felt his age. And I think, personally, enough time has passed. It's healed. He did a lot for the Packers. He spent good years here. He was one of the all-time greats. Let's celebrate that. And on a personal note, I feel like a damned underachiever because he's only a few days older than I am.
And he's being inducted into the Packer Hall of Fame. And I'm
What
sure,
have I done with my life?
And I'm sure he will be a shoo-in for the Football Hall of Fame in Canton. That's undoubted. Ben, what do you think about this?
Well, I mean, I echo a lot of Dave's sentiments. I guess there's no taking away what Brett Favre did when he was a Green Bay Packer on the field in uniform. A lot of my favorite Packer memories are of Brett Favre, throwing touchdown passes in the playoffs, and a lot of my worst Packer memories are of Brett Favre. Unfortunately for me, I'm one of the minority, I'm sure, that his off-the-field stuff really kind of distracted a little bit from his legacy for me. So in terms of the actual retirement of the jersey, I mean, I'm glad they're doing it. I'm glad they're getting it done now. It was interesting that he'd been telling Chicago radio stations and God knows who else that he was a little nervous about coming back to Green Bay so soon because he wasn't sure what kind of reaction he'd get from the fan base. But anyway, I think it's one of those things where we do need to honor what he did on the field, and I'd just as soon do that sooner than later. So, for me, I don't have to keep reading quotes from him and what have you in the news. So, tremendous player, a terribly odd young man in terms of just being a human being, likes to wear flip-flops around and say bizarre things. But, one way or the other, no matter how you feel about it, I'm kind of glad it's getting done this year.
Well, but by sheer numbers, led the Packers to 11 playoff appearances, 2 Super Bowls, 1 championship. He is the Packers' all-time leader in passing yards, touchdowns, and completions. He leads the second-place record holder, who I didn't write down, in all these categories by an exceptionally wide margin. And he did at one point, and I don't know if that's true anymore, hold the record for the longest consecutive number of games played.
I think he still holds that.
Okay,
Second streak. That's right.
Yeah, so he was the Iron Man, and now I have another question. You talked about him being nervous about the fan sentiment, and part of that, I don't know. We are a very forgiving state sports-wise. Without getting too far into baseball, after all of the stuff happened with Milwaukee's Brewer player Ryan Braun, and people were outraged about his doping and his lying about it, and I think more the lying than the doping, he went back on the field, and he's getting more flack from the fans of opposing teams than he is from the Brewers teams. There are still people who are mad at him, but largely we cheer, and we've kind of gotten past it. Do you think... I think that's going to happen with Favre, and I think part of that reason is because of the presence of Aaron Rodgers. Do you think things would be different if Aaron Rodgers hadn't stepped in and done so incredibly well? And Ben, as we were talking about before the beginning of the show, an elite quarterback, probably one of the best, if not the best, in the NFL. What do you think, Ben?
There's no question about it. It's like the old saying, nothing gets you over the last one like the next one. And in this case, we went from one All-Pro, potentially Hall of Fame quarterback to another. So, it was a very smooth transition. It really made it very easy for Packer fans to say goodbye to Brett Favre, those who were ready to do so. The interesting thing you just brought up about Braun, though, here's the distinction I draw, and all of you out there are welcome to chime in on this in our chat room right now, but I think, at least in terms of being a Wisconsin sports fan, the distinction between Braun and Favre is Braun has signed 2 long-term contracts, essentially one long-term contract and then one long-term extension with the Brewers. One thing that sports fans in Wisconsin really, really respond to is players who show that they want to be here, that they're not just here because our particular sports team pay them the most money, but people who are genuinely involved in the community and want to play ball here, whether it's basketball, football, or baseball. So I think, I think one of the things that really hurt Favre with fans isn't just that he went and played for the Jets or just went and played for the Vikings. It's the fact that he seemed to almost do that to spite the Packers. Like he felt like it was a war between he and Ted Thompson. So I do think there'll be a healing process, Amy. Those are great questions. But I think the lingering effect that Favre is having as opposed to Braun, I think has a lot more to do with the fact that he intentionally went to a division rival, whereas Braun is kind of glued to the community.
Yeah, and that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I do feel it was kind of like not stabbing us in the back, but maybe rubbing salt in the wound when he went to Minnesota, knowing how contentious that rivalry is. And it's probably, in my mind, I think it's even worse than the Bears because I kind of feel sorry for the Bears occasionally. Because, what's that song? The Bears still suck? Dave, go ahead.
It would have been great stuff for a Shakespearean play.
Absolutely.
Way that Favre schemed to get into the Vikings.
Yeah. So and maybe now he's gotten that out of his system and is ready to come back and sort of get the honors and accolades. But it's definitely going to be something that fills up the news cycles next summer. Now that they have a date set for this, and if I can be there, I plan on being there because Lambeau is a great venue. If you haven't seen a game or even just gone for a tour, I think the energy there will be incredible to see this.
Outside.
Yeah. So Dave was wondering, Taylor, if you had any thoughts on this because he's curious.
Well, as the resident Cowboys fan here, I live in Dallas, so that should just say it. I'm from Dallas. I live in Dallas. That should say it all. I'm not surprised at all that Brett Favre is getting his due. I think it helped that Aaron Rodgers did repair the relationship between the two last year. Really kind of started to have that happen. At the same time, a lot of players are able to get things patched up with their former teams eventually. Michael Young had a very bad falling out with the Texas Rangers down here, and he still was honored for everything that he did. Not a year later. Emmitt Smith had one of the nicest firings to ever happen when he was let go from the Cowboys and then signed with the Cardinals and then came back. It shouldn't be surprising at all. Mike Madonna went from playing with the Dallas Stars to spending one half season with the Detroit Red Wings, and he will always be remembered as a Dallas Star, not as a Detroit Red Wing, except for some of us here in Dallas who still like to hold it against him that he went and played in Detroit. I don't care one way or the other. He's retired as far as I'm concerned. So I think that it's unsurprising. It helps that Aaron Rodgers has been so good. It helps that the Packers have succeeded and won a championship and gone to another one. And I think that it's unsurprising. The honor is well deserved, and I would have been shocked if it had taken longer than 5 years.
Yeah, I don't think it would have taken longer than 5 years, but I'm surprised that it happened this quickly and there weren't any sort of rumblings beforehand.
It's been 4 years. I mean,
it has been 4 years, and I wonder. And you raised a great point that I didn't even think of, how Aaron Rodgers was instrumental in sort of helping to heal that rift. I mean, because I'm sure that there had to be hurt feelings there because this was Rodgers' chance. He was under Favre's wing for all those years, and then Favre left and all of a sudden wanted to come back, and that had to be difficult to see the person you looked up to and who mentored you kind of want to take away your moment in the sun, and it has worked out in our favor. We are very, very blessed to have somebody as wonderful as Rodgers back up Favre, and Favre, I think, is very lucky to have somebody like Rodgers willing to go to bat for him and sort of mend that rift. But that's what's going to come up, and that's going to be next year. And I'm sure as we get closer to the date, the excitement will grow, and I look forward to seeing what's going to happen and seeing what Brett is going to say, because the other thing that he's gotten better at since he's retired is his public speaking and doing the announcing and stuff, because there was a while there, if you remember his appearance on There's Something About Mary, he was very, very awkward in those situations.
How about Reggie White's movie?
And much better with a football in his hand, true, where you could see him reading the cue cards as he was talking. But I wanted to talk about sports because this is going to be a big story, and we'll probably revisit it when we get closer to the actual induction, because I think that's going to be great. And how long does it take before they are inducted into Canton? When can they be inducted?
I don't remember. I don't know if the rules are different from that than with baseball. I know baseball's rules. I don't really know anything about Canton.
So I'm sure he will be inducted into Canton as soon as possible.
I think so.
Retired a certain number of years. It might be 5 years, and maybe one of our listeners out there can help us. But I want to
Give me a second.
Oh, okay. Tyler's going to help us out.
Give me a second.
Taylor, I'm sorry.
I have to find it. It's going to take a little bit.
It's probably longer for Cowboys. It should be.
Let's see. It is, I'm going through the induction process right now. They've got to be retired for at least 5 years.
At least 5 years. So
same as baseball.
Same as baseball. So we're going to get close in the next couple of years. He'll probably be inducted into the Football Hall of Fame in Canton, and I think it would be deserved. Just based on his career alone. So
it would be a shock if he wasn't a first ballot Hall of Famer. Yeah,
I would.
I'm sure there will be some people who won't vote him in on the first. On the first, I mean, Michael Irvin should have been a first ballot Hall of Famer, and he didn't get voted in his first year because some people were trying to prove a point that they didn't like some of his personal life stuff. So, that could happen. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. Sports writers are weird.
That is true.
I don't think it'll happen with Favre. The records he's put up are just too much to be put aside.
But
it's not like a Pete Rose where Pete Rose just bet against his team. Favre hasn't gone to. He may have had his peccadillos and in his personal life, but who hasn't in modern pro football?
So peccadillos, that's a word that I'm going to have to use more often. That's a good word. But yeah, and Taylor has a point, and it could be right, but I will say that if he doesn't get in the first ballot, there will be some Packer fans who pick up torches and pitchforks and lose it if he doesn't get in on the first ballot.
Absolutely.
So just be forewarned, sports writers, that there will be some Packer fans. I will not be among them, but there will be some Packer fans who look to riot because they will be very, very, very upset about it. Speaking of torches and pitchforks, it's an awkward segue, but it works, especially if you lived in Wisconsin. The other thing I want to talk about today is last week, the Wisconsin Supreme Court handed down several rulings that we had been waiting on, and one of them involved the controversial, or at least was controversial, Act 10. For those of you that don't know what Act 10 is, it is the law that was passed in 2011 that limited collective bargaining for most public employees. It doesn't include police officers, firefighters, those sort of public safety workers. But it took away their ability to bargain on anything other than wages. And it was part of Walker's plan to reform Wisconsin's budget, to make them contribute something toward their health insurance, make them contribute something toward their retirement funds, and it worked. But if you lived in Wisconsin at the beginning of 2011, and pretty much from the beginning of 2011 through June of 2012, things here were interesting politically, and we've talked about this before, but we had essentially an occupation of the state capitol by protesters who were upset at the law. We had it was interesting. We had heated Facebook discussions, and there were petitions, and there was a recall that Scott Walker made history on, and he beat it, which hadn't happened before. And not only did he beat it with a greater margin than he won the gubernatorial election in 2010, and he ran against the same candidate.
Bland leading the bland.
Yes, the bland leading the bland. Very well done. But on Friday, or not on Friday, excuse me, last week, the Supreme Court handed down a decision, and they upheld the law as constitutional. And this is a victory. The decision was 5-2. Justice Michael Gableman wrote the lead opinion. It found that collective bargaining over a contract with an employer is not a fundamental right for public employees under the Constitution. Instead, it is a benefit that lawmakers can extend or restrict as they see fit. The teachers' unions and public employee unions are not happy with this ruling. I want to open this up because I think this is really important, because it's going to not only play into how the state's economy moves forward, it also is going to play a big role in the upcoming governor's election with Scott Walker taking on Mary Burke, pending the outcome of the primary, where maybe Brett Hulsey pulls off a win. We'll see. Anything can happen. Anything can happen. And I know here in Wisconsin, we do things differently than some states. We don't have to register with a party. But for things like primaries, we are required to vote a straight ticket. So if I choose to vote for, and I plan to vote for somebody like Sheriff David Clark, who is ostensibly a Democrat, I have to vote a straight Democrat ticket. I can't cross over and vote for a Republican. Nobody is running against Scott Walker in the primary Republican primary anyway, but I can't vote for any of the Republicans. I have to vote a straight Democrat ticket. And just to be contrary, I plan on voting for Brett Hulsey as governor. And on the off chance he wins, I think it'll be great for him to show up in the debates with his homemade Confederate costume.
Yeah,
and then we are guaranteed a second term for Walker. Dave, what do you think about them upholding Act 10?
I think this is the end of the line for the Act 10 opponents because other collective bargaining laws stricter than Wisconsin's have been upheld at the federal level, up to and including SCOTUS. So I think the opponents realize that they can't drag this out. This is it. Stick a fork in it. They're done.
You do think they are done?
I think so. Then again, like we're going to be talking about with the voter ID rulings, there are federal judges out there that rule that laws are unconstitutional simply because they don't like them. But again, I think this one, because this is more lenient than even the federal laws regarding collective bargaining on the federal level, I don't think they'd have much of a chance.
Okay. Ben, what do you think?
Well, I think Dave's onto something there. Act 10 is our version of this law, but there's an awful lot of states that have already passed similar legislation. Governor Walker didn't come up with this idea himself. He got it, in large part from Mitch Daniels, who is the then governor of Indiana. Indiana's got similar legislation, New Jersey, New Mexico, Louisiana, Michigan, Idaho, on and on and on. There's quite a few states that have similar legislation. And I know some of, as I've said before, some of our listeners aren't from Wisconsin, so just a quick backdrop so you kind of know what we're talking about. In January 2011, Wisconsin faced a $3.6 billion budget deficit. We had a then Democratic Governor Doyle who was leaving office, and our new governor, a Republican Scott Walker, took over. And the first thing he did when he sat down at his desk was he was looking at a $3.6 billion budget hole. So he's since written a book about this and other items, but I just wanted to read a small little section here where he talks about it. He says, on day one, we faced a stark choice. We could raise taxes or lay off more than 10,000 government workers to close the gap, or we could reform the corrupt system of political cronyism and collective bargaining in which union bosses collected involuntary dues from every government employee and had effective veto power over any changes to their pay, benefits, or working conditions that was driving our state into fiscal ruin. So, as part of his Budget Repair Act, he passed Act 10, which required public workers here in the state of Wisconsin to contribute 5.8% of their salaries to their pensions. It was up from something like 3% before. And he also required that they pay 12.6% to their health insurance benefits, which, as most of you, if not all of you out there listening, you almost certainly pay more than that at your job. So it's still an incredibly beneficial package that state workers here in Wisconsin have. There were other provisions in the law as well that were very beneficial to the workers, including it dissolved the forced remittance of union dues. From now on, the public workers could decide themselves if, in fact, they wanted to pay union dues and be part of the union. So even though this isn't as much an attack on workers as a lot of the Wisconsin union people want you to believe, that's kind of been the narrative about the law. So I think that when the Supreme Court, when SCOTUS makes a final ruling on something like this, whether it's an official one that will be a blanket law to cover all states, I don't know. But I think it's got a really, really good chance of just being, as Dave's put it, at the end of the line and upheld, because there really isn't a substantial challenge to it in terms of ideology. It's not an attack on workers. It's not an attack on 99% of the population. So, I think it's really about just fine fiscal conservatism.
No, and that's an excellent point. I want to tie this into the larger question because we talked about the primary, and I joked about voting for Brett Hulsey, but it looks like, and it's almost 100% certain that Mary Burke is going to be his challenger. And in the article that I'm reading from the Journal Sentinel, which I will pop up into the chat room, Burke is quoted as saying, let me find that once more. She is quoted as saying that the court decision didn't change the focus of the race on jobs and the economy. Burke has said she supported cuts to worker benefits made by Act 10, but she disagreed with Thursday's Supreme Court ruling, noting that workers have a right to retain collective bargaining. I think that's one, contradictory, and two, we can look at Burke's record. She does sit on the Madison School Board, So she votes for policy. And in an article from the Wisconsin State Journal, this law is finally just going to start affecting Madison teachers and government workers in Madison, because they've pretty much ignored it this entire time. They went, before the law took effect in 2011, and entered into multi-year contracts. And then those contracts were extended for several years after Dane County Judge Juan Colas ruled the law was unconstitutional. So now it's really only going to be a matter of time before they feel the impacts of this law too. And for Burke to say that it harms, it takes away the workers' right to retain collective bargaining, it doesn't. It limits what they can do with that power, but they can still form a union. They can still pay union dues. What it does do is say that you don't have to be in a union. Right. When you signed up or started working a government job in Wisconsin before Act 10, odds are they were going to immediately and automatically take those union dues from your paycheck. You didn't get a choice. You had to be a member of the union. Now you have that choice. And
that's exactly it. Yeah.
So you're not involuntarily funding the Democratic Party.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of it, or being forced into a relationship that maybe you don't want, or spending money that you don't want. And I don't know what the union dues range to, but I wouldn't want money taken out of my check for something that I had no interest in being a part of. You think Burke has been pretty quiet about what she would do on a lot of issues when she becomes governor, but do you think that Act 10 is going to be a bigger issue now in the race? Do you think that Walker can get her on record, and what impact will it have on her candidacy? I'm going to start with you, Dave.
I think it may have some impact, but the race is still too close to call. We'll see what happens when they debate each other, when they bring the issues out, and what she really thinks.
Yeah, the race is close, and we'll talk about that Marquette Law poll in a minute. Ben, what do you think about this impacting the governor's race?
Well, it's certainly an issue that she's trying to run on. She's trying to make an issue of it. What she and a lot of Democrats in Wisconsin find is that there's still a lot of political traction to be had with Act 10, even though the law itself is, darn near come to the end of the judicial road. It's been challenged and rehashed and tried and all that kind of stuff. And the other thing to consider is, since it's been in place, we've now done a budget, the next budget as well, with Act 10 in place. The thing about Act 10 is Walker was trying to give tools to local municipalities. These local
I'm not exactly sure what happened there, but this is the Modern Comment Show here on Vigilant Liberty Radio. I am your host. Well, your host. I'm not your host. I'm your producer, Taylor. I think I know what happened, which is my computer decided to throw a minor heart attack for a second. So give us just a minute. We'll take a break, and then we'll be right back. This is Modern Comments Show here on Vigilant Liberty Radio.
Hi, I'm Dustin Hoyt with America Our Way, and you can hear me right here on Vigilant Liberty Radio at 10/9 Central on Thursday nights. We bring you the best in political commentary from the right-wing, conservative, libertarian perspectives coming together and bringing the best content on the internet. Be sure to tune in every week for your favorite shows. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
How much of people's income do you, Michael Moore, want the government to confiscate?
Probably twice what we're paying right now.
It's not envy, it's war.
Where's the rage? Where's the uprising?
Storm the doors of the New York Stock Exchange.
It is a class war.
Storm the doors of the New York Stock Exchange.
If the wealthy paid their fair share. For a documentary filmmaker, I do really well. I'm very blessed.
And the rich thought poverty was bad.
I do well.
They get rid of it.
What pure? There's nothing pure about capitalism.
And they know what's coming on Wall Street.
We're seeing the end of capitalism. And I say good riddance.
He is one of my favorite capitalists. Yeah, I want to give him a hug.
This is Lachlan Marquet of the Washington Free Beacon, and you are listening to Vigilant Liberty Radio.
And back here on Modern Comments Radio, here on Vigilant Liberty Radio, I am your producer, Taylor. It's been a long day, folks. So that is one of the things that happened. We are working on getting Ben Lund back, but we do have Amy, who is here, as well as Dave. All right, so I believe at the time when we left, y'all were talking about the law requiring the collective bargaining new laws, and I think we have been back now. Ben, are you there?
Absolutely, thanks.
Excellent.
Awesome.
When you really got interrupted, you were giving which is my fault, by the way, you were giving a description regarding the collective bargaining, I thought. Why don't you go ahead and pick up where you were?
Well, thanks a lot, Taylor. I was just saying, I think in terms of the governor's race, it's not going to be a huge issue. The local paper has estimated about 8% of the state hasn't already decided whether they're going to vote for or against Walker. That's very much like the George W. Bush race, where you're voting for or against one candidate. Walker's very much that candidate. So it's unlikely that Burke would be able to do anything to really substantially pull back Act 10. There's an awful lot of Democrats in town in Milwaukee as well who actually find the tools in Act 10 to be quite a positive thing. So I think it's mostly rhetoric, and I don't think it's going to affect the race a whole heck of a lot.
Okay. I'm hoping that we were going to talk about the race and in the context of the Marquette Law poll, and I put the link to the poll in the chat room, and the polls are tight. I think on the last Marquette poll, it was 46-46 between Burke and Walker. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I know you and I, Ben, talked about this on Twitter when the law poll came out toward the end of July. And I'm just curious if you think that's going to change, or if you think that this is bad news for Walker in terms of where he is in his first term and being 3 months out roughly from the next gubernatorial election. You had said you predict him winning by 5, but let's talk about that.
Sure. Well, back in 2011, as you'll recall, Walker had to face a recall election. He was voted in as governor. The whole Act 10 thing went down, and then he was actually recalled. Okay. Prior to the recall election, his approval rating here in Wisconsin, same polling people, had his approval rating down to 37%. Now, that's about where Obama is these days. So literally, that is the basement of approval ratings. So his approval rating was way down before he had his recall election. I think it was something, and this one's just off the top of my head, but I want to say it was something like 56% of Wisconsinites polled at that time had an unfavorable view of how he was handling the state. And then he did a better job of coming out, and he said in the past he did a poor job of explaining Act 10. He just tried to kind of do it instead of explain it first. And so by the time the recall election came around, a number of factors were kind of worked together in sequence, but one of those things was I think people began to realize in the state that the reforms were working. And one of the things that the Democrats in the state now are hammering about was he made a campaign promise back then that he was going to create 250,000 jobs. Now that's a quota that he's fallen short of, admittedly. And I think part of the reason is because the tools in Act 10 are still kind of being examined and put to use in the state. And frankly, the entire country is coming out of a recession. So I think the fact that his poll numbers were so low before the recall election, and he ended up being who is the mayor of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett, by I want to say 7 points in that election. And I don't think he's done anything to hurt himself politically since then. So I think what this poll reflects more than anything is, number one, you're polling Milwaukee people, and it's awful hard to get a good even base, not to take anything away from Marquette Law poll. But in addition to that, I think a lot of the people who support Governor Walker aren't necessarily people who are pundits. They don't go on the internet. They don't take polls. They don't tweet about it. They don't Facebook about it. They just show up on Election Day and vote. So I think he's probably in a lot better shape than the Marquette Law poll leads them to believe. And the fact that his opponent this time around, Mary Burke, is a political newcomer who's done absolutely nothing to define herself as a candidate or her vision for Wisconsin, I think is going to keep a lot of the people that don't like Walker home on Election Day. So it's a bold prediction on my part based on this poll, but I'm sticking to the prediction that he wins by 5 points or more.
Okay. Yeah, and a correction on those numbers. The numbers as of the last poll were 45.8 for Walker and 44.8 for Burke. So it's a margin of, 1 percentage point, which is definitely within the margin of error. I'm hoping that as we get closer to the debate, like you said, Burke she's almost been willfully ignoring coming out on firm positions. I, for example, I don't believe for a second that she supports the changes that Act 10 made to the state and the collective bargaining rights. She's waffled back and forth, and her time in Madison as a school board member kind of echoed that sentiment. And I'm hoping that when we get closer to the election and the debates come out and she is forced to be on record as, this is my position, this is where I'm going to be, and this is what I'm going to do, because she talks, and we talked about this, about, investing in schools and investing in this and investing in that, but she never talks about where the money is going to come from to invest in any of these things.
Exactly.
And we need to get her on record for that, because this is an important race, and it does have implications for 2016. And I know what is going to come in the chat room, so I'm going to give it a shout out now. Chris in the chat room will say tanned boobs 2016, but Walker is, as of right now, a contender for the presidency. He could be the top candidate, if not a vice presidential option, in 2 short years. If he doesn't win this election, any chance of him going anywhere beyond Wisconsin is going to be pretty much shot.
And let's just face it, with Democrats in Milwaukee and Dane County, especially Dane County, the Democratic candidate could walk around stark naked down State Street and proclaim his love for barnyard animals, and they'd still vote for him over Scott Walker.
Yeah,
Speaking of which, there's Brett Halsey.
Brett Halsey, I mean, he showed up at the GOP convention here in Milwaukee in a homemade Confederate uniform. And I've said I'm going to vote for him, but I'm not a supporter. But he has his supporters who want him to run against Mary Burke, and clearly plan on voting for him. So it's not that far of a stretch. But when you look at the results from the recall election, I think it was something like, I want to say 5 counties that Walker didn't win handily. And Dane and Milwaukee are 2 of them. And even there, it wasn't as big of a floor mopping as I expected it to be. To look at the map of the recall results is sort of breathtaking. And if Walker can duplicate that even 75-80% of the way, maybe he will win by 5 points, and that would be a comfortable win. It would be a comfortable victory, and going into the hopefully next 4 years of his term. One of the things that they'll probably use against him in the upcoming gubernatorial election is the fact that he's kind of backed off of committing to a full second term amidst all the talk of maybe running for the White House. Do you think that's going to have a big impact on the upcoming election, or no? Is that going to be it? Go ahead, Ben.
No, I don't think it's going to have much of an impact, other than the fact that, as Dave points out, he's and as you do too, he's certainly a presidential candidate early on. Now, we're quite a ways out from 2016, and there's an awful lot of names that are kind of hovering around the bowl, deciding whether to toss themselves in. But that's another thing too. Is I don't imagine a lot of conservatives in Wisconsin are going to stay home, because it absolutely would be disastrous for his presidential hopes if he were to lose the gubernatorial race. And you were talking a little bit about Halsey. For those of you who aren't familiar, there's essentially 2 Democrats running for governor against Scott Walker. One is Mary Burke. She's a millionaire, owns a Trek bike company. And long story short, as Amy's pointed out all night long, she's kind of a focus group candidate. You know, she comes out and says a lot of things that sound really good, but then when you explore a little bit deeper, there's very little substance. Halsey, on the other hand, is really all flash and not much else. He's quite insane. A friend and I went to one of his fundraisers here in Milwaukee, and while he was there, he was mentioning that Scott Walker actually called him. Now, this is just to let you know about how concerned Scott Walker is with Brett Halsey's campaign. Halsey said as soon as he declared that he was going to run for governor, Scott Walker, the Republican governor, called him up and said, "I want you to have fun with it." So I don't think he's entirely scared of Halsey. Halsey's just kind of there to bother Mary Burke and to muddle the glass, so to speak.
True.
If in the highly unlikely scenario that Brett Halsey wins the governor's race, the mothership will reclaim Madison.
Yeah, absolutely. If Halsey wins, we should all go to Canada.
We'll figure that out. But if that happens, then yeah, I don't see that happening. I can't even make a promise on that one because there's no scenario in my mind that wins. Yeah, Brian, on closer examination, Burke is kind of the party line shill. I will give the Democrats credit, though. After running Tom Barrett for governor 3 times and having him get walloped, they finally learned their lesson and have not run Tom Barrett for governor a 4th time. So kudos to them. And yes, Chris, hand boobs 2016. We'll work on that, but for right now, it's a possibility.
Are we talking about Hillary's boobs?
No, we're not. We're talking about something completely different. Thank you for that mental image. But we are going to be going to the polls, and the primaries are actually coming up next week. One of the other things that we want to talk about before the program wraps is one of the other rulings that the Supreme Court in Wisconsin made, which I think is going to be more controversial and is not going to die off as easily as Act 10, and that is the Supreme Court upholding the state ID, the voter ID law. First, I'm going to put up from April the article where it was overturned by a federal judge who said it was unconstitutional and put a undue burden on people who didn't maybe have access to voter ID to vote. Or to an ID to vote, and then the talk of the ruling the Supreme Court handed down, they found it constitutional. The Supreme Court found it constitutional. They tweaked a provision in the voter ID law to make it easier for people with to get identification cards without having to pay one along the way. The Supreme Court upheld voter ID in a 4-3 ruling. It is still, however, tied up in federal court because a federal judge said it was unconstitutional. I am in favor of voter ID if you know anything about it. Several states have it, and I put up a link to a site called Ballotpedia that my guest Ben found, which is a great resource. It kind of covers election law and that kind of thing from states to states. But it's a popular issue, and it's popular with Democrats and Republicans. Several states have voter ID, and when it's gone to higher courts, the challenge has been upheld. It's been upheld as constitutional. And Wisconsin needs voter ID. Voter fraud happens here. Tom Barrett, to bring him back into the conversation, has said, give just one name of people who have committed voter fraud. And if I did a Google search, you could probably find several people who have been convicted of voter fraud or accused of voter fraud here in the state of Wisconsin.
But they don't count for some reason.
Yeah, apparently those are names that he does not want to hear. I don't anticipate this law being in effect for this year for the governor's race in the fall or any of the elections in fall. But I'm hoping it'll be in place by 2015, especially for the presidential election in 2016. So is this going to be, again, tying it back to the overarching theme of the governor's race, is this going to be a big issue in the governor's race or no?
I don't think so. I think the federal judge, is it Lynn Edelman who...
Yeah, Lynn Edelman was the one who...
thank you freaking much, Governor Thompson.
Yes, that was one of the mistakes of Tommy Thompson's tenure as governor.
But liberal judges tend to overturn laws because they don't like them, forget precedents, forget anything else. If they don't like it, it's unconstitutional, no matter what the Supreme Court had ruled beforehand regarding other ID laws. Lynn Edelman didn't like the law, therefore it's unconstitutional, and that is a way of buying time and votes for the Democrats for this upcoming election.
I bristle every time somebody says that somebody can't get an ID because they're too old or they're too poor. Because my grandmother she lived to be 84. She never drove a car in her entire life. But she made sure that every few years when her ID needed to be renewed, she got her butt to the DMV, renewed her ID, and paid whatever the fee was. And at one time I had done the math on what it would cost for a non-driver's license ID. And it's pennies. It's pennies a day to have excuse me for a minute. It's pennies a day to have an ID.
A little bit of full disclosure. I don't drive.
Yes.
For a variety of reasons. Ask Amy what it's been like to have me drive behind the wheel.
It's a better for all of humanity that he doesn't. But so Dave has an ID, and when we moved into our house and had to update our records, we both were able to go online and do that for free. Neither one of us had to pay because neither one of our IDs had expired. We were able to get a new one for free. The state has been very accommodating in making sure people who need the IDs have access to them, and they aren't that expensive. So this notion that people are either too old or too stupid or too poor to get an ID always kind of gets my hackles up, because it's the possibly lamest excuse that they can come up with.
And how many things do you need an ID for?
And how many things do you need an ID for in the state of Wisconsin? I will be blunt, and I love my grandma very much, but the only reason she had an ID was so she could go to bingo and collect her winnings. I mean, she went and got it, but that was her hobby, and she made sure she had her ID so she could get what she needed. You needed to write checks, to open accounts, to get your money out of the bank. I can get into some nightclubs to buy alcohol if you buy alcohol at the local pick and save chain, because they ID everybody, even if you're 95 years old and buying a bottle of booze.
On the pretext that it's actually a 19-year-old theater major with very elaborate makeup.
Yeah, so you need an ID, and this notion that people can't get it and therefore we can't make them vote, or we can't have them show an ID to vote, is ridiculous. Ben, what are your thoughts on this?
No, I agree with you right down the line, Amy. You had mentioned a few states have voter ID. 34 of the 50 states have some type of ID requirement, either photo ID or ID with your address on it. And many of those have photo ID. So, first of all, it's not something that just the evil Republicans in Wisconsin are trying to pass. It's a standard all around the country, accepted by a lot of states, including a lot of southern states, Alabama and Hawaii West and Arkansas. I mean, all these other states have photo ID. Number two, you talked about how little it costs. The cost of Wisconsin to get a photo ID is zero. Let me repeat that again. When they passed the voter ID law, I want to say this was in 2010, 2012? Whenever they passed the voter ID law, a provision in that was that all you have to do is go down to the DMV with any kind of documentation, birth certificates, a mail with your address on it, that kind of thing. Tell them that you want a state issue ID for voting purposes, and it costs you zero. They take your picture, they issue your ID, and you go home with everything still in your pocket. So it costs nothing to get an ID in Wisconsin. Like I say, it's a standard that a lot of other states have. The real behind baseball in this whole thing, a lot of the Democrats in Wisconsin love to tell you it's racist. I mean, they'll go as far as to tell you a voter ID in Wisconsin is like Jim Crow. Someone literally said that the other day. And that's pretty par for the course for Democrats. But I would submit this. As Amy points out, you need an ID for all kinds of other things in life, at least as important as voting, to get a job, to apply for benefits, to get a library card, to do anything. You've got to have an ID. And my particular congresswoman, I live in a liberal part of Milwaukee, which is, to my detriment. Fortunately, my congressperson is Gwen Moore, and she sent out, I got one at my house, which described how racist the idea of voter ID is and how many minority people and poor people would never be able to vote. But what's funny is nowhere on that pamphlet did it talk about how to get an ID or how much better their lives would be, these constituents of hers, if she would go help them get an ID. So none of the Democrats in town are talking about how to bust people to the DMV to get their IDs. What they're really concerned about, and this is the bottom line, and I'll let you guys jump in here, it's about turnout. The Democrats everywhere have a tough time getting their bases to turn out for a variety of reasons. And so what they're really concerned about is when voter ID is in place, it's going to hurt their turnout even worse, and they're probably right.
You mentioned that Hawaii has a voter ID law that is one of the most ethnically diverse states, probably the most ethnically diverse state in the union for a small population, and it's always been predominantly Democrat, and they have a voter ID law.
True. And I will have to look through my mail because Gwen Moore is also my rep. Do you know who is running against her in the primary, Ben?
The two people running against her, was it Gary? I'm spacing
George.
Gary George, thank you.
Gary George, yes. So we have quite the selection on the Democrat side of the ballot. Because if you don't know, Gary George just recently got out of prison for serving a felony conviction. And I don't remember what it was. It was for
Catholic boy gone bad.
It was for some sort of corruption. So those are our our congressional candidates here for Ben and I in Wisconsin.
And the felon might be the better choice. That's how sad it is.
Yeah, I was. You went there, but I was going to. But yes, I will look through my mail and see if that piece is in there, and I will post pictures of it because I don't recall getting that. It may be targeted because I know you live on the east side, and we are a little more conservative over in my neck of the woods. But seeing as this is Milwaukee, we are still in the minority.
Yeah, our longtime pastor representative got purged
for being a moderate. Peggy Krusik, yes. Back in the last election, she got beat in the primary and lost her almost quixotic attempt at a write-in campaign, which was very, very disappointing. We are coming up now to the end of the program, but I want to take just a minute to talk about something else that's going on in Milwaukee. MPS has several empty school buildings, and one of them is the long vacant Malcolm X Academy, and a private school, St. Marcus Catholic Church wants to buy this. St. Marcus Lutheran Church wants to buy it to turn it into a school. And instead of allowing them to buy it and turning it into a school, Milwaukee Public Schools and a developer called 2760 Holdings, they sold it to this developer, ostensibly with the purpose of turning it into some sort of community center. But this whole deal just kind of stinks. And real quick, Ben, I'm going to let you have a minute or two to just talk about this, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Sure. Well, what's really going on is MPS is Milwaukee Public Schools, and what they're afraid of is the governor in the state here is taking less federal money. And so they've gotten some of their federal funding cut. Now, keep in mind, a lot of these teachers over the last 2 or 3 years have also retired because they wanted to seal in their really good union benefits before Act 10 went into effect. So what you have now is MPS fighting private schools, I beg your pardon, for what they consider their market share. So part of the Wisconsin State School Choice Program, which right now is capped at 1,000 students. 1,000 students from poor backgrounds, the parents don't have the money to send them anywhere but MPS, now all of a sudden can put their kids on a waiting list, and if you're lucky enough to win the lottery, you're one of these 1,000 kids, then your parents can send you to one of a number of participating private schools, which may or may not be religious schools, but undoubtedly have at least as good an educational opportunities and better facilities, all of that kind of thing, than some of the MPS schools that these kids have had to attend. So MPS, rather than stepping aside and letting someone else try to teach these kids, obviously has essentially is sitting on empty school buildings around the city and refusing to sell them to any other proprietor who might want to compete with them for the education of children, whether or not that's in the best interest of the kids. So that's probably a whole nother show by itself, Amy. But absolutely, public schools here in Wisconsin are fighting tooth and nail not only to fight school choice, but to fight anyone else who might get a chance to teach those kids.
True, and this will be something that we revisit on another program, because it is school choice is a topic I'm very, very passionate about, and I want to talk about this, and I want to delve more into what they are doing, because something here isn't right, and we need to figure out what it is and maybe get things changed. And one of the things that I'm hoping that we'll see in the next term, provided Walker wins and the Republicans retain control of state government, is a lifting of that school choice cap and an expansion to school choice, maybe even on a statewide level. I understand why it wasn't done during the last term, because after the blow up of Act 10, I think Walker kind of reined it in on policy just to avoid having another blow up and giving them another reason to be outraged. But I'm hoping that next session we will see some really good conservative policies come through this administration, provided things go well in November. Now we are getting to the end of the program. Stick around. I know Taylor said that the Right War is up next, but it will be a repeat.
Yeah, we're going to be repeating last week's show, as it'll be over at FTR. We'll be repeating last week's show, which involved Stephen Cruiser talking to Liz. And we will be back tomorrow, though, with a brand new edition of Right War. It's United Liberty. It is United Liberty Night, so Jason Pye will be around.
Excellent.
But there you go.
Excellent. So you can stick around, and it's simulcast here on VLR, and then over at FTR. Friday night is the Conservative Feminist Show, which is a blast, and that's on at 11 Eastern. Saturdays is the Saturday Night Cigar Lounge with Taylor. Sundays is Next, and Mondays is Their Finest Hour with Alan Bordius, and Tuesdays is the Roundtable of Extreme Liberty. So tune into one of our other programs. Thank you for listening tonight. Ben, where can we find you online?
Well, I'm on at Twitter on @EastsideRambler, all one word, and that's probably the best way to get a hold of me. And yeah, it's been great joining you all. And remember, everyone, 9:00 on Wednesday nights, Modern Comments Radio. It's really been a pleasure. It's flown by, and I know everyone out there who listened had a great time. So thanks again for everyone.
Yes. And Taylor, where can we find you?
You can find me at EYE Desert Blog. That's at EYE Desert Blog on Twitter.
Excellent. And you can find me at Modern Comments on Twitter. You can also find me at my blog, which I need to update more, moderncomments.wordpress.com, and I occasionally contribute to Real Raw Right. Thanks again for being on. Dave was also on, and I want to thank him. He had to step away. But I had a lovely discussion, and I look forward to talking to you all next week when we're back live here on Vigilant Liberty Radio. Have a good night, everybody, and take care.
This show is copyright by VLR Media. All opinions of hosts, panelists, and guests are their own and may not reflect the opinion of VLR Media or anyone else.